I think failure is one of the best things that people can talk about, in particular managers. So I'm going to share 2 failures with you. Maybe I'll throw in a few more for fun, but I have 2 that really informed the way that I think about people, about management. One comes from my teaching career, and one comes from my management career. And then I'd love to share some of the ways that those failures helped me to grow and to have a good practice. There are no slides here because these are really things that I'm hoping that you engage with and think about, not because of what's on my screen, but because it connects with your life and maybe some things that you've failed about and not felt so good about. Think about what you can get out of those. So the first failure I remember with people is I was in my very first year of teaching, and so I'm 22 years old in an American public high school, and I have a chamber group of string players. So I have 3 girls, and they are in the 10th grade, they're 15, and I have two boys in this chamber group. And the girls are they're testing, they're pushing, because that's what teenagers do. They push your boundaries. So they are everything I ask them to do. They are making sarcastic comments, or they have snide remarks. And one of them finally says to me, well, this is just not going to work. It's clearly going to be a problem. Now, what I should have said was nothing. But what I did say to the boys was, gentlemen, can you please go to the practice room and work on these measures? And so they're like, sure. So they go to the practice rooms and bring their music and their music stands with them. And I said to the girls, there, now I can focus on the problem. That is a brutal thing to say to 3 15-year-old teenage children. I said it. And I realized as soon as I said it that I'd done the bad thing. And I think many of us have been in the experience as students with teachers who've said the bad thing, the wrong thing, and taken that attitude. So the class ends, and I'm feeling miserable. Saying and being sarcastic did not do anything for me except let my emotion out of my body and my frustration out of my body. So I called the secretary. I found out where all the students, what classes they had, and I asked them to come to my classroom one at a time. And to each of them, I said, listen, what I did and what I said was absolutely inexcusable. I was feeling frustrated, and I had absolutely no right to take out my frustration on you. I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry. And the 3 of them were really confused by this, which was, to me, a little bit sad, actually, because what it told me about kids is that they're kind of used to teachers saying really not great things to them, which I just find sad, but I also had it in my own experience. But then, the other thing it taught me was that as leaders of any kind, as managers of any kind, we have a deep responsibility to our students and to the people we're managing to keep them in mind. They are our priority. They are our job. And so the lesson that I really learned from that failure was that I was behaving in a way that did not align with my values at all. So I learned that I need to behave in the ways that align with my values about how I want to treat people, about how I want to interact and be interacted with. I also learned that behavior helps to build trust. So all 3 of these girls. This is now 18 years later. All 3 of these girls are actually still in touch with me, and I with them. And I realized that I realized that I can build stronger relationships and gain trust by apologizing for the situation that I created that was not good and was not healthy. So I was very fortunate in that moment that I figured it out that day. It wasn't weeks or months later. It was basically that day. I have a lot of shame around that failure because it hurt other people. And I think it's really important to share it because we all have these moments where we do things that we're not proud of, where we have failures that can feel deeply shameful. And I share it to also let you know that there is something we can all do about these things and making sure to act congruently with who we are and with our values. My second failure story is a story about a communications breakdown. And I think this can be really tricky because we have this mental vision of managers as people who are sort of all business, following all the rules, not having emotions, where in fact we know that that's not really the case. I mean, every manager I've ever worked with is a person, is a human being, and human beings are emotional beings, and sometimes emotion trumps logic. And at the same time, I think that a lot of the sort of older ways of thinking about management and about work tell us to leave ourselves outside, like leave it outside the door. And I have not personally experienced that has been effective for me. So this next story is when I was a director at Salesforce. So this is a few years ago. And it was just a really, really me. So I was one of these managers. I felt like I could never take time off. I need to always be there. I need to be present on my phone, answering, all of these things. And I also felt that I needed to not tell people what was happening in my life. And so I just thought, you know what, let me just keep this to myself. Well, the thing I was keeping to myself was that one of my former students had died in a motorcycle accident earlier in the week. And I was a wreck. It's very hard when anybody passes in our lives. And when I came to this realization that this young life was just taken in such a violent way, I was heartbroken. So I attended this student's funeral in the morning and took some time off in the morning, didn't tell anybody the reason that I needed the time, but I took the time. And there were some things bubbling up in my team across multiple different organizations. And there was a team member who was really causing a lot of drama around these situations. I was tired. I was vulnerable emotionally to responding because I wasn't really in a good space to be doing my job, which was to emotionally be strong and guide other people and help them make good decisions and help coach. So again, I'm watching all of the conversation happen in this channel around this drama. And again, what I should have done or said was nothing. But that's not what I did. Instead, I jumped into the channel immediately and I started making these sarcastic comments. And these comments were absolutely coming from a place of deep emotional frustration and pain, which left me vulnerable to not responding in a way that would actually move the situation forward. This was a massive fail, and my boss, the vice president, called me out on it immediately. And so what I learned from that failure was how my boss dealt with that failure. He taught me how to deal with those situations in the future, but he also taught me how to deal with when somebody is in the same space that I found myself in that day. So the thing that I was really able to learn from that situation was, instead of trying to pretend that everything was fine and I'm the manager, so I'm supposed to be strong and perfect, not possible. Instead, I learned to own my vulnerability, to recognize that I was vulnerable. Also, as a manager, meant that I could recognize and support in other people their need to be vulnerable, their need to take time and have those moments that they're going to fall apart, because we are people. And certainly the past year and a half have taught us that that is very, very true. We've learned this as we're watching our friends, our colleagues, people around the world suffering, people working from home and trying to keep their families together and trying to keep their kids in school and keep, multiple workstations going. All of these things have really shown us just how vulnerable people are, and how making space for that as a manager can allow for a much healthier, much more open space for work to happen. And this is honestly a lesson that I needed to learn by just falling down into it. So in a sense, I'm not happy that I did that, but I am glad that I had the experience, and I'm glad that I had a manager who could see that experience for what it was, who could respond to me in a way that honored what I was going through, and who could teach me a better way to sort of fail up gracefully. And now I don't consider saying that, I don't consider sharing my vulnerability a failure. I think the failure for me was was believing that I wasn't supposed to share these things. Like, I actually think that was the failure. And because of that failure, I treated other people poorly. And I did things that, again, I'm not proud of. I believe that these things happen, and that we can move through them, and that we can be more mindful of what it is that we choose to do and how it is that we choose to act. So being able to admit failure has really helped me in a number of ways. One, knowing that I don't always need to be right in a situation, or even if I am right. For example, in that situation where I was having, this really tough day and just responded in a way that was not a professional communication, I was not wrong about what needed to happen. I was wrong about the way I communicated it. And what I learned was that instead of having to go forward in that moment and just put my stake in the ground and be right, I can say, I can take time. I can have conversations when I'm ready to have them, when other people are ready to have them, and I can learn from my mistakes and go forward. Also, failure is a real moment of humility. Everybody fails. We all do. Some people talk about it. Some people write books about it. Other people never talk about it. Other people are afraid to talk about it or feel that it gives them a lack of credibility. And failure, what it allows us to do when we talk about and normalize failing, is it allows us to share a piece of this human experience that every single person on our team, every single peer, and every single person both above us in our organizational structure, below us, every person in our lives has failed in some way. And this ability to talk about failure and admit failure gives us an ability to connect with others. Something that I really find helpful from a management perspective is sharing my smaller failure stories with the people on my team, So that way that they realize I'm not looking at them through a lens of expecting perfection. I'm looking at them through a lens of expecting them to try things, learn from their failures, and find a way to move forward successfully. Something else that failure teaches is flexibility. So failure really lets us, as it certainly has let me as a manager, say, okay, that didn't work. So in that moment where I was being sarcastic, where I was, and I was feeling emotional in my response, I also felt that I had to say something. I had to have a decisive opinion, and I need to do it now. And really, that was not a flexible approach to the problem. It didn't allow me to learn. It didn't allow me to do anything helpful. And if I had maintained that kind of an approach toward management, if I'd said, whenever I'm frustrated, I am going to be sarcastic and not communicate clearly, I would have lost a lot of respect for my team, and I wouldn't have built the resiliency I needed to identify my own vulnerability, to identify vulnerability in others. So through failing, through recognizing things that felt like failures to me and learning how not to repeat those things in the future, I really allowed myself to become a more flexible manager and to address a wider variety of situations. Another aspect of admitting failure is admitting that there is no one right way to do things. So that can be really hard, because when we go to school for whatever we're going to school for, or when we take a management course, or when we have an education that sort of says this is the way things are, it can feel necessary to have all the answers. And something that admitting failure has allowed me to do is to free myself up to ask the questions. So rather than saying, this is the answer, this is the only way, this is the right way, or this is the way so-and-so does it, so this is the way we're doing it, by saying, you know what, I've failed, other people have failed, I can pivot and start to ask questions about what can this approach, what multiple ways that we could try this, and then inviting lots of conversation, and as a manager saying, based on all of this great feedback and all of this great conversation, here's the decision I'm taking, and here's how we are going to move forward. And I think that it's really helpful to allow for those spaces and that kind of reflection, but you can only do it if you don't believe that there's one right way. And failure gives us a beautiful opportunity to let go of the one right way mindset. Another reason to admit your failures is that people don't hold your failures against you as much as you feel like they will. And I'm a person who gets really anxious about this. I'm highly anxious about, what if I do something wrong? What if I don't get it right? What are people going to think of me? And I think the best example of this is that all of the people who I failed in my stories, all of the people who both those students and the employees who I was engaging with, in a way that I really felt where I failed, because I was able to admit the failure, work through it, apologize, and be flexible and take a different approach, I still have relationships with all of these people. And their relationships I consider positive and fruitful relationships. So clearly my ability to look and say, yeah, I failed, I did this wrong, has allowed those people to find forgiveness or empathy, or a way to say, okay, this is not who she really is or who she wants to be. And it's allowed those people to give me the opportunity to experience the joy and richness of their lives. And I also think that when we admit failure to our teams, it's not making us look weak, although it can feel that way. When I've made a decision, for example, there are always decisions as a leader that you make, and in the moment it seems like the right thing and you really gathered your evidence, and then weeks or months later you look back and you think, ooh, that I could have done this differently, I could have done that differently. And when I've had those negative effects, I've gone to my team and I said, listen, I made this decision, didn't work the way I thought it would, here's a problem that we're facing, how can we do this together, how can we move forward together? Owning your own failure is surprisingly liberating, because my team didn't turn against me and say, yeah, you're terrible, you did all the wrong things, how dare you. These are the risks of leadership, these are the risks of management, and these are the risks of being a human being who takes responsibility for themselves and their actions in their life. And sometimes that means admitting failure. What it also means, when other people see that behavior, at least in my experience with my teams and with my students, is that I have a lot of trust built up, and I've built up a lot of mutual respect in those relationships. Finally, having failed in a multitude of ways has given me a starting point to do better learning. So as that 22-year-old teacher in that classroom with those 5 kids, until I did that, until I had that moment where I was absolutely sarcastic and not a good human to those kids, it never occurred to me that that was the wrong way to communicate, because I had been communicated with that way my whole life. It didn't occur to me just how bad that was. And when it did occur to me, when I did the bad thing, when I failed, and I realized I failed, and when I took responsibility and I took action about that failure, and then apologized for that failure and changed my behavior from that point on, it gave me a starting point to be the person who aligned with my values of being generous, of being helpful, and of not harming other people through my behavior or actions. So I'm not happy with what I did in that moment. I am grateful that I had the ability to reflect on it and realize it didn't match my values, and to use that failure as a true learning point in how to be a good teacher and how to be a better human being in my life. So these are really the key learnings that I would communicate to you through these failure stories. And I know that I've taken a different approach to this. Maybe you were expecting more technical failures, more failures about software or not. And what I want to say very deeply to all of you is that any endeavor that we do as human beings first. Human beings build software. Human beings test software. Human beings use software. So the need and ability to learn from our interactions and our failures and our successes in that realm with human beings will enable us as managers, as peers, as coworkers, and in our lives and in our families to have this strength, and then we can bring that wherever we are. So as tough as it can be to talk about my failings, I've chosen these 2 for you, and I really hope that there's there's something in there where either you've learned from me telling, if you're young and you haven't done those mistakes yet, I hope that you've learned not to do them. And if you've done some of those mistakes and you're like, I hope that my sharing helps you release any feelings of shame or upsetness that you have around that failure, and focus on, okay, what can I do to make this moment and these failures that I'm having fear about or upsetness about how can I turn that into a learning and an action rather than a source of regret? I'm hoping that this is helpful to you, and I so appreciate the opportunity to share these stories with you and to talk with all of you. I very much appreciate the comments. I do apologize. I found them a little bit distracting through some points in the talk, which is where you sort of maybe caught me being a little bit off guard or distracted in my talking, but much appreciated. So thanks so much.
Thank you so very much, Jess. This is my first talk of you that I have attended in person. I must say I'm your fan. I admire your courage, your honesty, and your authenticity, and sharing all these insightful stories. We certainly need to have more discussions around this. We certainly need more managers to acknowledge this all. And I would say thank you for being who you are. Your talk has definitely made an impression on me in person. There are some questions if you would like to answer.
Sure. Let me.
Yeah, or I can read them for you. What if someone misuses your empathy?
So something about emotional control, and this is something I learned through through studying dialectical behavioral therapy, is that we own our emotions. So there are many ways that people can use or misuse if we're very good and very understanding. So for example, I'm empathetic and I see somebody having a hard time, and then that same employee keeps having a hard time, right? And they think, oh, you're so empathetic, manager, so I'm gonna get, extra stuff from you. I honestly say I haven't had that happen. And when that does happen, a really honest conversation saying, I noticed that the past several weeks, you've had some difficult situations and you've needed more time off. The impact on the team or on the organization or on the work is this. So can we talk about what this is that you need and why you need it, and make it a conversation about what's happening and about them, and particularly about their situation and their behavior. You don't have to give up empathy in order to reinforce what is needed for the good of the team.
Awesome. There is one interesting question from Linda. She's asking, what if your manager is inappropriate with their anger and is sarcastic with their comments? They seem to use this strategy to be condescending. To add on that, I would say I don't usually appreciate labeling people with disorders or things, but what if your manager has narcissistic tendencies, gaslighting you every other time, trying to make you feel very small? How do you do with it all?
So this is a situation where I think it can be really difficult if you have honestly the bravery to go to your manager and sort of use SBI in reverse. So SBI is situation behavior impact feedback. So when any of us goes and says, you're always condescending or you're always sarcastic, it sets up the dichotomy of always never, and people become extremely defensive about that, and so generally doesn't get us what we want or need. But if you can write in an email, if you're not comfortable face-to-face, or go to your manager and say, listen, on Tuesday, when you said exact quote of thing you said, I felt that this is what you meant. This is how I took that situation. And it really made me feel uncomfortable. So that's an option, to sort of do the situation behavior impact to the manager. That may not be an option. If you're working with a truly dysfunctional leader, you may need to take that same SBI approach and go to your manager's manager or to your human resources, like whoever in the company kind of deals with that, and different organizational structures are really different. So I couldn't say exactly, but what I will say is whenever you're talking with people about their behaviors and about changes that you want to see, really try to use SBI feedback and keep it super focused on the situation without making a judgment about them. because we don't know what's true or false. We don't know what's happening in somebody else's lives. And so it's not to say accept the behavior, but make sure you're really stick to the facts.
Cool. Thank you so much. I